Oh, the bobbies in Carrig were shaking in fear when some raiders with arms came flocking in here. They called on surrender, no answer they got. Begor, says their leader, will fire on the spot. Cheer up.
The events that occurred in Carrigtwohill village on the 3rd of January 1920, when the local RIC barracks was attacked and forcibly evacuated by a troop of Republican volunteers, stands out as one of the most significant events in Cork during the War of Independence. Over the past 100 years, these events have been recorded in local lore as the first barracks to be taken in Ireland. But what actually happened, and who were the orchestrators and perpetrators? With the help of witness statements of those involved and contemporary press reports, we have pieced together not just an accurate account of the events of the night, but also the build-up and the aftermath. Finally, we assess the significance of the events in the overall context of the War of Independence. The mastermind of the plan to capture Carrigtwohill RIC Barracks was Michael Leahy from Cove, Commandant of the 4th Battalion, the Cork No. 1 Brigade, and also Vice Brigadier, Cork No. 1 Brigade. It was a plan that was some months in the hatching, as Leahy recalls.
The time would be about the month of October 1919, when I put up a proposal at a brigade meeting in Cork that every RIC barracks in the brigade area should be attacked and captured on a certain night, the attacks to be simultaneous. I believed, in fact, I was convinced at the time, that the capture of at least 90% of the RIC barracks in the area would involve nothing more than walking in and taking them.
While the brigade leaders in Cork were taken with the idea, it was decided to send Thomas McCurtain, the commanding officer, to GHQ in Dublin with a proposition that all RIC barracks in the country be attacked on one particular night. On his return, McCurtain reported back to a brigade meeting in Cork. Leahy was present and subsequently updated a local battalion meeting.
That GHQ considered that the remainder of the country was not so well organised as Cork, and that consequently the proposed attacks should be confined to the area of the Cork No. 1 Brigade. This area ran roughly from Youghal, thence to Cork City, by the coast to Gougane-Barra in the west, back northeast to Fermoy and down south to Youghal.
The brigade initially chose a date in December for the attacks, but when this was countermanded by GHQ, McCurtain was again dispatched to Dublin for an explanation. Leahy again takes up the story.
When McCurtain returned to Cork, he told us that Mick Collins had said that an attempt was to be made in Dublin to shoot Lord French, then Lord Lieutenant, and that the success of this job was more important from the publicity angle than the proposed barrack attack.
This particular plot proved unsuccessful. However, GHQ leadership made a significant decision in relation to the Cork No. 1 Brigade District. Leahy once more provides the latest update on events.
It was, however, agreed by GHQ that 3 RIC barracks be attacked in the 3 different brigade areas of Cork. The barracks to be selected by the respective brigade OC. The Brigade Council then decided that one of the barracks in my area should be attacked, and I selected Carrigtwohill as one offering the best chance of success.
With the decision finally ratified, preparations could now begin in earnest. The attack on Carrigtwohill RIC station would go ahead on Saturday night, the 3rd of January 1920. The other 2 barracks chosen for simultaneous assault were Ballygarvan and Kilmurray. The attached testimony of Captain Michael Burke of the Cove Volunteer Company highlighted the amount of preparation that went in from their perspective, with arms that had been stashed away many months earlier being resurrected for what was clearly a significant ratcheting up of the military offensive.
Some weeks prior to the proposed attack, we opened up the arms dump, which was near the home of Battalion OC Michael Leahy at Ballywilliam Cove. In Leahy's house we cleaned the 9 lever-action rifles which were taken in a raid by Cove volunteers on O'Keefe's gunsmith shop Cove in April 1918. We found the rifles and ammunition in excellent condition. We brought the guns to the house of Joseph Collins, Tay Road, Cove. The house was on the main road between Carrigtwohill and Cove.
The successful implementation of an operation as complex as the taking of the, by then, heavily armed and fortified Carrigtwohill Barrack involved meticulous planning, clinical execution and, above all, secrecy and the element of surprise. Burke highlights the secrecy surrounding preparations. With the exception of those who planned the operation, not even the participants knew the plan until the last minute.
During the week prior to the barrack attack at Carrigtwohill, Daithí O'Brien OC of the Cove Company and I selected the Cove men to take part. These men were not notified until the day.
This supports the explanation given for the absence of a direct local involvement in the raid by Francis Healy, a Shanballymore native who lived in Carrigtwohill and worked for the Great Southern and Western Railway. He was a section commander of the Carrigtwohill-based D Company, 4th Battalion, 1st Cork Brigade. In a witness statement in the 1950s, he explained,
"The IRA attacked and captured the local RIC barracks at Carrigtwohill early in January 1920. For security reasons and to avoid suspicion being aroused in the locality, the local company was not called on to participate in the attack."
Michael Leahy also observed a major increase in security at RIC stations generally by December 1919, compared to the relatively lax situation in October.
At this particular time, early January 1920, it was observed that all RIC barracks were being fortified against attack by having steel shutters put on the windows with loopholes for firing. It is my opinion that some word may have reached the British authorities of our intention to stage a general attack on barracks a few months previously.
These developments will also have strengthened the growing realization in Republican circles that the presence of RIC stations throughout the country was a highly effective means of intelligence gathering, which needed dismantling for political reasons. Leahy, as commander of the Cove Company, orchestrated the plan of campaign and laid out his strategy.
The RIC barracks was in the main street, one of a row of houses. It was a stone-built building with a slated roof. The windows were steel shuttered back and front. My plan was to open the attack on the front and rear of the building with rifles and grenades. When the attack was on for some time, I proposed to call on the garrison to surrender, and if they refused, I would then blow a hole in the gable end of the barracks and take the place by assault. I decided to use the Cove, Middleton and Knockgraha companies as they were the best armed companies in the battalion.
The 3 companies involved got their preliminary instructions from Leahy a few days in advance. The troops only discovered the exact nature of their mission when they assembled for duty.
I instructed Diarmuid Hurley, captain of the Middleton Company, to have all available men assembled at 10 p.m. in the Carrigtwohill schoolhouse, situated on a by-road on the south side of the village. I contacted Martin Carrig, captain of the Knockgraha Company, and arranged that he should parade his company at Knockgraha at about 9 p.m, when he would get further instructions from me. On that same Saturday afternoon, I called the officers of the Cove Company to a meeting at my home in Ballywilliam Cove. We arranged that about 40 men would take part in the night's operation.
A last-minute hitch concerning a chosen dispatch driver led to some confusion, which may have resulted in 2 dispatch vans actually making the trip from Cove to Carrigtwohill. Eventually, however, the arms cache was transported by Jack O'Connell, a long-time officer of the Cove Volunteer Company, as he vividly recalled in subsequent testimony.
On the evening of the day of the attack, I commandeered the van in Cove. I brought Dahi O'Brien, Tom O'Shea, James Ahern and Maurice Moore to Carrigtwohill. Shortly afterwards, James and Maurice lost their lives when the column was attacked at Clonmult in February 1921. We were all armed with rifles and arrived in the village at about 10 p.m.
Joseph Ahern of the Middleton Company recalled that the initial steps in isolating the Carrigtwohill barrack were also carried out by the Cove Company.
Early in the night, volunteers from the Cove Company were detailed to cut the communications and, as usual, made a thorough job of it.
This was done between 9:30 p.m. and 10 p.m. Timing was vital in this regard. Too early and suspicions would be aroused and the alarm raised. Too late and contact might be established before the lines were cut. Leahy recalled the cycle from Cove and observed that the preparations were steadily being put in place.
It was arranged that the Cove officers would commandeer a motor and bring it to Carrigtwohill that night, conveying some rifles and grenades, which I had obtained on loan from the brigade for the proposed attack. I left Cove by bicycle for Carrigtwohill about 9 p.m. En route, I met up with about 30 of the Cove volunteers, cutting trees to block the road from Cove to Carrigtwohill.
The greatest volume of men were initially concentrated in the erection of barriers on the main approach roads to Carrigtwohill. From the Cove side at Fota on the Carrigtwohill side of Belvelly Bridge, from Middleton in the Minister's Hill Mile Bush area, and from Cork in the Killecline Bridge area. This involved cutting down and dragging trees and other obstacles to cause a road blockage, which had to be completed in a short time frame. Between 20 and 30 men would have been deployed at each point and would have likely remained at these outposts throughout the siege until orders to dismiss were received. This was to delay the advance of any oncoming support troops and secure vital time for the raiders to escape. The need for stealthy movement to avoid or minimise suspicion on the approach to Carrigtwohill was imperative, as Michael Burke recalled.
It was arranged that the men would proceed to Carrigtwohill in ones and twos on bikes, and that 4 or 5 others would commandeer a motor van in Cove that evening, collect the arms at Collins's house and go on into Carrigtwohill.
In the meantime, the Middleton Company was assembled by Diarmuid Hurley at Ballyvodak, before taking the roads to Carrigtwohill via Ballintubber and Murty's Cross to Barrayscourt to the assembly point at the Old National School, with little danger of being observed. Middleton volunteer Sean Kelleher provides the details.
On Saturday night, 3rd of January 1920, B Company, to the number of 30 men, were mobilised at Ballyvodak on a by-road which leads to Carrigtwohill. The time was about 9:30 p.m. Hurley informed us that we were to proceed to Carrigtwohill to attack and capture the RIC Barracks there in conjunction with the Cove Company, with whom we were to make contact close to the village of Carrigtwohill. We marched to the old schoolhouse at the eastern end of Carrigtwohill and about 400 yards from the barracks. On arrival, we were detailed for different jobs, including patrols.
In his testament, Michael Burke indicates that the Cove contingent assembled initially at the Cork side of the village, where they distributed arms before going through the village to establish contact with the Middleton Company.
In Carrigtwohill, I met Michael Leahy, the battalion OC, who instructed me to select a man with a revolver and go through the village to the schoolhouse, where I was to pick up 2 men from the Middleton Company armed with revolvers. The party of 4 of us were then to go to the main street, and we were to shoot any RIC who might be on the street when the attack on the barracks opened.
The need for such drastic action, as outlined by Burke, was eliminated by what he next describes. These events probably occurred shortly after 10 p.m, while the attack on the barrack did not commence until about 11 p.m, by which time all the RIC officers were firmly secured in the barrack.
I was proceeding along the main street towards the schoolhouse when, near the police barracks, I heard shouting and the noise of someone running down the street. One of our lads who had preceded us up the street had been stopped and taken prisoner by a couple of RIC men. He happened to be wearing a very loose-fitting overcoat, and as the policeman held him, he wriggled out of the overcoat, leaving it in the hands of the police. He was John Moore of Cove.
It was an interesting affirmation of the accuracy of Burke's account that it closely mirrored those of the RIC officers in press articles in the immediate aftermath of the attack. The Skibbereen Eagle on Saturday the 10th of January reported as follows.
In pursuance of their ordinary duties as peace officers, Sergeant Scott accompanied Constables Hogan and O'Sullivan on patrol through the village. They left the barracks at 8 o'clock and at the outskirts of the village passed several cyclists riding 4 and 5 abreast. It was remarked that none of the cyclists carried lamps, and Sergeant Scott, seeing this uninvited procession, called upon the riders to stop. They refused to do so and went in towards the village.
The report then goes on to relate the particularly energetic efforts of one cyclist whose bicycle slipped and got damaged, and who then discarded his overcoat in a successful bid to evade apprehension. Monday's Cork Examiner confirms the obvious conclusions of the RIC officers.
His action, however, convinced the police that something out of the ordinary was about to happen, and they immediately returned to the barracks. This was about 9:30. They telephoned to Middleton and advised the police. But when they tried to ring Queenstown at 10 o'clock, they found that the lines had been cut.
The significance of the escapee from the clutches of police in terms of the success of the operation will not have been apparent to them at the time, but is highlighted by Burke.
The RIC made no attempt to approach us, but instead proceeded hurriedly into their barracks. It was fortunate, both for us and for Moore, that he evaded capture that night. He was the man who was to blast a hole in the barrack wall to enable us to force an entrance, and he was carrying in the inside pocket of his coat, not his overcoat, the sticks of gelignite for the blasting operation.
By now, interaction between police and cyclists had resulted in the RIC officers adopting siege mode within the barracks. Despite intervening events, Burke still carried out Leahy's initial instruction to check out the main street for RIC presence on making contact with the Middleton Company.
I got in touch with the 2 Middleton men in the schoolhouse, as instructed by the OC Michael Leahy, and informed the other volunteers there to proceed to a hayrick at the rear of the barracks. 4 of us went out on the street, but saw no RIC.
Leahy, having observed the Cove Road being blocked off earlier, had by this stage completed all arrangements for the isolation of Carrigtwohill village.
Arriving in Carrigtwohill about 10 p.m, I went to the schoolhouse where Diarmuid Hurley had his Middleton men and gave instructions for the blocking of the Cork-Carrigtwohill Middleton Road. The Knockcraha men under Martin Corry then received instructions to block the Knockcraha-Cork-Carrigtwohill Road. These blocking operations completely isolated Carrigtwohill. I should of course add that telephone and telegraph wires leading to and from the village were also cut.
Indeed, we get a very clear picture of the extent of the cutting of communications out of the village in a clip from the Cork Examiner on Saturday the 10th of January.
The Postmaster General is claiming £70 in respect of damage caused by cutting of 26 telephone wires, 12 telegraph wires and 3 telegraph poles, with telephonic installations in the barracks destroyed. The wires were stated to have been cut between Clydugh and Carrigtwohill, between Tullagreen and Cork, and between Queenstown Junction and Queenstown.
With both road and telecommunication access to Carrigtwohill now cut off from all angles, the final part of the security plan before commencing the attack was to ensure that no one got out to raise the alarm. Patrick Whelan takes up the story.
I, together with other members of the Midland Company, was instructed to be at the road junction at the Midland end of Carrigtwohill village at 10 p.m. On arrival at the assembly point, I was given charge of 5 or 6 Midland lads with instructions to detain all civilians and prevent them from leaving the village. I was to trust no one and detain without distinction any person, man or woman, who wanted to leave the village after the attack on the barracks had begun. I was armed with my .32 revolver. "I hope you realise the importance of your job, Paddy," said Dermot Hurley. "Any one of those you let through could report the attack to the RIC in Midland with disastrous results to us."
Before the attack commenced, one family of local residents were confronted with a frightening experience, which would become a part of local lore. The incident is first mentioned in the Skibbereen Eagle on Saturday the 10th of January.
The raiders meant to hem in the police and force them to surrender. Shortly before 11 o'clock, a score of them entered the premises of Mrs. Catherine Murphy in the street opposite the besieged building, and took complete possession of the building. Mrs. Murphy and her 2 nieces were in the house at the time, and these were ordered to clear out and everything would be all right.
Now the firing it started at Kate Murphy's shop, where Lizzie and Molly were ready to drop, and Kate in the kitchen didn't know what to do. She ran out in the yard without stocking her shoe. She ran over the field, they'd Donny Hartnett to call, "For the honour of God, take me over the wall." From that to Dick Flynn, and she knocked on the door, and there she remained till 3:45. Cheer up, jolly fellows, don't die in despair, for the rebels in Carrig are devils may care.
Jim Fitzgerald from Knockgraha, who was intimately involved in the compilation of the history of the Knockgraha volunteers from Liberty Hall to Sing Sing, had the foresight to interview Lizzie and Molly Murphy back in the 1970s. In this extract, he captures the panic following the dramatic arrival of the intruders.
On the night of the attack, January the 20, Catherine Murphy was in her shop on Main Street with her nieces Lizzie and Molly Murphy. At around 10 o'clock in the evening, they were preparing to retire to bed, having no inkling of the ensuing drama. Catherine Murphy was going up the stairs with a lighted candle in her hand, and Lizzie and Molly were in the kitchen. Without warning, the back door of the house was burst open, and 10 or 12 young men, brandishing rifles and revolvers, rushed into the kitchen. With that, 5 or 6 of them made to go up the stairs. Catherine was already on the stairway, going to bed. On seeing them heading for the upstairs room, all she said was, "Boys, what's the quickest way out?" She ran down the stairs and went out the back door as quickly as possible in her bare feet. Before leaving the house, she shouted to Molly to grab the money and take it with her. On seeing the gunmen, Lizzie made out the front door of the shop. The gunmen advised her not to go out on the street, but she did not heed their advice. She opened the front door and ran out across the street into Mulholland's. Molly went out the back door and into Kennedy's house, their next-door neighbours. The gunmen went upstairs into Murphy's and took up positions inside the 3 windows. They firstly removed the windows, and then they got cushions inside and knelt down. They trained their rifles on the police barracks, which was across the street, 20 or 30 feet nearer to Middleton. Just as Lizzie Murphy reached the shelter of Mulholland's, she heard the firing on the barrack commence.
All was now in readiness for the attack. Leahy recorded the final checks before giving the signal to commence the siege. He also revised assessment of the numbers deployed to Murphy's shop.
For the actual attack, I placed 4 or 5 men with rifles in houses across the street from the barracks. I myself took up a position with 6 riflemen, some with grenades, at the rear of the barracks. 2 or 3 of these men were in Hayshed with me, and about 3 others behind the wall, about 10 feet from the gable end of the barracks. Dermot Hurley, Joseph Ahern, and about 4 others from the Middleton Company, armed with rifle and revolvers, came around to my position in the Hayshed, about 5 yards from the barracks.
Map number 1 covers the 3 blockades on the 3 main arteries into Carrigtwohill from Cork, Cove and Middleton. Each was situated about 1.5 miles from the village. An average of about 25 men would have manned each to enable construction work to be done quickly. Map number 2 highlights the location of the 2 checkpoints at the eastern and western ends of the village, manned by Middleton and Cove volunteers respectively, to prevent anyone leaving to alert the authorities. Each manned by 1 armed and about 5 unarmed volunteers. Patrick Whelan was the armed guard at the eastern end. Map number 3 shows the battle site and surrounding area, and the positions taken up by all the main protagonists. Location 1, the barracks, was defended by the RIC forces of Sergeant Thomas Scott and Constables Clancy, Hogan, O'Sullivan, O'Shea and Stack. Location 2 was Kate Murphy's shop and was taken over by 5 or 6 co-volunteers because of its strategic location across the road from the front barrack door. Names of the occupants here are not confirmed. Location 3, there was a group of 4 men with a roving commission on the main street between the 2 checkpoints. 2 from Cove, including Michael Burke, and 2 from Middleton, including Joseph Ahern. They went to the rear of the barracks once the battle commenced. There were initially 7 co-volunteers with rifles behind wall and in Hayshed at rear of barracks, including Michael Leahy, Tom O'Shea, Dahi O'Brien, Jack O'Connell and John Moore. Once the shooting commenced, they were joined by the 4-man roving group and also by Dermot Hurley, Sean Kelleher, Jack Ahern and some other Middleton volunteers. The following played a key role in the battle, but their exact locations during the fight is not certain. Maurice Moore, Paddy O'Sullivan, Jack Higgins, Jack and Ned Stack, all from Cove, and Tig Manley, Michael and David Desmond, Michael Hallinan and Gerry Hearn, all Middleton. All these men were either in Murphy's shop or behind the barracks for the attack. There were a few press references to those taken in for identification during the following week. The Carrigtwohill Constabulary were, however, unable to identify any of those presented. These reports and the reference by volunteer Joseph Ahern helped to identify a number of other volunteers involved in the raid.
Cork Examiner, Thursday, 8th of January. In connection with the Carrigtwohill onslaught on Saturday night, 5 young men, Maurice Horgan, Gerry Hearn, Joseph Ahern, C. White and Michael Hallinan, were arrested while at their work in Middleton yesterday and taken to the Middleton barracks. None of the men was identified and they were released, being cheered in the street as they emerged. Cork Examiner, Tuesday, 13th of January. Queenstown, Monday. 16 young men were arrested at Queenstown today and conveyed in a military motor lorry to the police barracks here, for the purpose, it is alleged, of being identified as participants in the recent Carrigtwohill raid. Failure to do so caused their release.
3 days afterwards, I, with 4 of my comrades, M. Desmond, D. Desmond brothers, M. Hallinan and Gerry Hearn, last named being a first cousin, were arrested and conveyed to the local police barracks, where we were paraded for identification before the Carrigtwohill RIC. They failed to identify us and we were released immediately.
Michael Leahy, officer commanding who orchestrated the attack, takes up the story.
About 11 p.m, when I had satisfied myself that every man was in his allotted position, I gave orders to open the attack. Fire was begun by our riflemen in front and from those of us in the rear. Grenades were flung at the barrack windows, but because of the steel shutters on the windows did not damage. The RIC replied with rifle fire and grenades. Very lights were sent up by the garrison. This continued for about a quarter of an hour when I concluded that our fire was ineffective and had no chance of forcing a surrender of the RIC. I therefore ordered that the gable end of the barrack wall be dynamited with a view to obtaining entrance and taking the place by assault. John Moore from Cove, a quarryman well versed in the art of dynamiting, was appointed for the job. A few men bored about 5 holes in the barrack wall while John inserted the sticks of gelignite. Constant fire was kept up on the RIC to cover the men engaged in this operation. About an hour elapsed before this was completed. Meanwhile, the garrison in the barracks kept up a continuous fire with rifles and grenades. Our men replied sporadically.
Another of Leahy's accomplices at the rear, John O'Connell of Cove, who was also the driver who delivered the artillery, corroborates Leahy's account and throws some light on others involved at the rear.
I was in a position behind the wall at the back of the barracks when the attack was opened by us about 11 p.m. Daithí O'Brien of Cove was with me. Mick Leahy, the OC, and Tom O'Shea of Cove were in a hayshed a few yards away from me. At the first burst of rifle fire from us, the police sent up very lights and returned our fire. O'Brien and I directed our aim on the loopholes in the steel shutters on the barrack windows. This went on for a considerable time.
Joseph Ahern of Middleton, wounded the first through the breach with Dermot Hurley, gives his thoughts on the beginning of the battle.
I had a roving commission, and as it was my first time under fire, I went round the back of the building to test my reactions. The results were good, so I proceeded to visit the outpost situated at various points in the village where I met Hurley. I asked him what was going to be done now. He replied that we were going in. I then asked him who was going in, and he replied, yourself and myself. He added that the OC wanted somebody else, but that he chose me.
Patrick Whelan, who was stationed by Hurley with others at the eastern end of the village, gave an insightful perspective on developments from his location.
At about midnight, the peace of the village was rudely disturbed by outbursts of rifle and revolver fire. The attack was on. For the first half hour, I was all on edge. There we were listening to the continuous rifle fire with no knowledge of how the attack was progressing. After the first half hour, I remember being satisfied that all was well. The firing was steady and continuous, and there was no retreat. I began to feel happy and confident of success. So far as I can remember, we had to detain only 3 men that night. They lived only a few hundred yards from the village, and they took their enforced detention without giving any trouble, so my task was an easy one.
Michael Burke, who had a roving commission on the run-up to the attack, details his actions and experiences once the attack has commenced.
When our attack opened with rifles and shotguns, I made for the hayrick at the rear of the barracks, guided by a local man who said he knew the place well. We got to a position behind the barracks and proceeded to cross an iron gate when we were fired on from the barrack windows. To add to our misfortune, some of the volunteers on the hayrick mistook us for RIC, trying to escape, and fired on us. We got out of this to a position behind the pillars of a gate on a field. After some time, we proceeded to within 2 houses of the barracks.
Jim Fitzgerald from Knockgraha indicates that the volunteers' password for the night was "Soldiers are we," for which the reply was "Whose lives are pledged to Ireland." The use of this password could have been very useful to Burke in this situation to avoid crossfire, but he doesn't make any reference to it. Meanwhile, Sean Kelleher from Middleton took up his position behind the barracks for the attack by crossing fields behind the village from the initial assembly point at the National School, along with a few other Middleton volunteers.
I and a Middleton volunteer named Jack Ahern were ordered to cross fields south of the village and get to a shed adjoining the western gable end of the barracks. We were actually on our way to the shed when rifle fire was opened on the barracks by men of the Cove Company from positions nearby. Firing by both sides continued for half an hour or so when I was detailed, along with John Moore of Cove, a county council quarry worker, to place a charge of gelignite at the western gable of the barracks to blow a breach so that the building could be rushed and the garrison forced to surrender. If this also failed, we had a tin of petrol with us to burn the place, if such was necessary, to compel the RIC to surrender. John Moore and I placed the gelignite in position and sent word to Mick Leahy, the battalion OC in charge of the attack, that all was ready. He gave instructions to explode the gelignite. The fuse was then ignited, and when the smoke from the explosion had cleared a bit, we could see a breach in the barrack wall about 6 feet by 4 feet.
Michael Leahy corroborates Kelleher's account and explains the decision to seek the surrender of the garrison rather than to burn down the building.
When the dynamite exploded, a large hole was blown in the gable end of the barracks, sufficient to admit 2 men at a time into what was the barrack day room. Bundles of hay soaked with petrol were placed in the breach. It was my intention to burn out the garrison. At the last minute I decided against doing so, as I learned that 3 of our lads had been taken prisoner earlier in the night in the village by the RIC and were now in the barracks. I therefore decided to enter the barracks by the breach in the wall and call on the garrison to surrender.
When the hole it was blown, it made a great space, where the peelers and raiders they stood face to face. The bobbies surrendered, they had to give in. They were tied up and handcuffed by some disguised men. Cheer up, jolly fellows, don't die in despair, for the rebels in Carrig their devils may care.
We commence accounts of the takeover and departure process through the eyes of the volunteers. However, press reports from around the country in the days that followed enable us to view the story from the perspective of the police and the authorities also, together with local reaction. Michael Leahy recalled their entry to the day room immediately after the explosion and the ceasefire of the surrounding volunteers once entry had been achieved.
About 4 of us, including Joseph Ahern and Dermot Hurley, got through the hole into the day room and found that the RIC had taken to the rooms upstairs. We fired a few shots through the ceiling. Before entering, I had sent word to all my men in firing positions to cease firing at a whistle blast to be given by me. I blew the whistle when we were in the day room. Our lads ceased fire and I shouted to the police that we were inside the barracks and that they should surrender.
Joseph Ahern, who along with Hurley was first through the breach, recalls in great detail the sequence of events on entry to the barrack.
We proceeded to the barracks and negotiated the crossing safely. Entering the outbuilding, we took some time to accustom our eyes to the intense darkness, and after some instructions from the OC, proceeded to crawl through the aperture. Hurley was first, and I got through almost immediately. Standing in the day room, we shook hands before proceeding to cross towards the staircase, where we could hear slight movements in the intense silence which now prevailed. When we got to the doorway situated at the foot of the staircase, Hurley whispered to me to kneel down. It was well we took the precaution, as at that moment the RIC, who either heard us moving or saw us silhouetted in the faint light that was coming through the fanlight, now opened fire. Chunks of plaster fell all round and on top of us, and in the confined space the noise was intense. We returned the fire.
Ahern also recalls Hurley's presence of mind and attention to detail in the heat of battle.
Apparently Hurley was noting everything carefully, as I heard the whisper in my ear inquiring how many rounds I had fired. I replied 6. He told me to reload, as he had fired 4 and he wished to reload. This accomplished, he shouted to the RIC to surrender. There was a lull in the firing and we heard sounds of a discussion going on upstairs. After a time we heard a woman's voice inquiring if we would leave a woman out. Holly replied that he certainly would and instructed her to come down at once as we were going to set fire to the barracks. A very frightened woman arrived at the bottom of the staircase and inquired what we would do to the police if they surrendered. Holly informed her that they would be quite safe. She communicated this to the RIC, who shouted that they were prepared to surrender if their lives were spared.
Although there is a difference of opinion as to who negotiated the surrender with the police, Leahy's recall of events is otherwise broadly in line with that of Ahern.
At the top of the stairs, I saw Mrs. Scott, wife of the RIC sergeant, with a baby in her arms. The sergeant was behind her. I told the woman to come on down, that nothing would happen to her, and ordered the sergeant to stay where he was and keep his hands up. He did this. She and her baby were taken by one of our lads to friends of hers in the village. I again called on the garrison to surrender. They did so, coming down the stairs with their hands up.
Sean Kelleher was one of a number of volunteers who now entered the barracks through the breach and recalled the tidy-up operation following the garrison's surrender.
They were ordered downstairs to the day room, where they were placed under guard. Other volunteers had by now entered the barracks, and all of us made a thorough search for arms and ammunition. We collected the rifles and revolvers of the garrison together with some bombs. They were taken away to a safe destination. The task completed, we withdrew to Middleton.
In the meantime, the group of volunteers maintaining the checkpoint at the eastern end of the village were second-guessing progress from both the noises and silences emanating from the main street. Their commanding officer, Patrick Whelan, anticipating success, approached and entered the barracks.
About an hour had elapsed from the time the attack began when we heard an explosion. Our lads were after blowing a hole in the side walls of the barrack with gelignite. Then came a silence. This lasted so long that I guessed the attack was finished. So, instructing one of the men with me to take over, I proceeded to the barracks. The attack was indeed over and a complete success. The first two men I met when I entered the barracks were Paddy O'Sullivan and Morris Moore, both of Cove, who were later to join the 4th Battalion Flying Column. They were captured at Clonmelt in February 1921 and executed by the British in Cork Jail. I knew both of them well as we were at school together in Cove, and brave lads they were. Paddy had 2 half-crowns in his hand. "I found these in the day room," said he to me, adding, "What would you do with them, Paddy?" "The same as you're going to do, Paddy," said I, and he did.
There was a corresponding checkpoint at the western end of the village, and it was here that a local man's delayed journey home from a romantic rendezvous earned him a place in local folklore history.
The first came along that the raiders had seen, Johnny Power from the rock coming from Tullagreen. When asked by the raiders what he was doing there, he was courting the lassie with the dark curly hair. The raider he laughed with a wink in his eye, "I pity your case, my poor Irish boy. It's no night for courting nor neither for stroll, so now if you please put your nose to the pole. Cheer up, jolly fellows, don't die in despair, for the rebels in Carrig are the devils make air."
Following the end of the siege, the volunteers quickly set about concluding their business before departure. Leahy again takes up the story.
We had by this time opened the front door of the barracks, through which a number of our men entered and proceeded to search the place for arms and equipment. The police were lined up, searched for papers and handcuffed. We marched them out onto the village street. All the police carbines, a quantity of revolvers and some shotguns taken by the RIC in raids were captured together with a large quantity of ammunition and some grenades. The stuff was put into a motor car and taken to Manley's place at Tuberine about 4 miles distant.
Leahy had already arranged for the arrival of transport with Michael Burke to carry away the arms collected from the barracks. Time was of the essence, lest suspicion of any of the surrounding RIC units were aroused.
When in the day room, I was instructed to go down the village to the crossroads at the railway bridge, bring up the motor van and cove men and dismiss the other volunteer unit there. I brought the car to within 100 yards of the barracks. The captured arms and ammunition were put into it and taken away by some of our men.
Joseph Ahern corroborates both Leahy and Burke's account of the removal of the arms supply to a safe destination.
The captured arms were now loaded in a captured motor car and, as I was the only volunteer able to drive, I was given the job of taking them to a place of safety where they would be carefully stored and looked after with a view to future use. Tig Manley accompanied me, and as we drove through the night he, Tig, unloaded the police carbines by the simple process of pulling the trigger. The hood of the car was perforated in several places, which would necessitate a new hood, and I hope the owner received adequate compensation. Arriving in the townland, rejoicing in the name of Tuberine we were met by Tig's brother, Sean, and a few other volunteers who quickly removed the arms from the car. Tig remained behind and I started on my homeward journey alone. Arriving at Ballyedmond Bridge, about 2 miles from Middleton, I abandoned the car and walked cross-country home.
The following excerpt from the Freeman's Journal of the 6th of January appears to tie in with Joseph Ahern's account of the removal of the arms cache and leaving the stolen car at a predetermined location. The Hallinans were prominent business people in Middleton. A car used by the co-volunteers for similar purposes, the property of a Queenstown merchant, was subsequently abandoned on the roadside by the cemetery on their return to Cove.
Whilst the sons of Mr. Ed Hallinan, Middleton, were motoring from Cork to their home on Saturday night, they were held up near Carrigtwohill by a number of armed men, and were then ordered to leave the car. They were then taken to an adjoining house and ordered to remain in it until they would receive further orders. After some hours, Messrs. Hallinan were released by armed men and were informed that they would find their motor car at a certain place which was indicated to them. They then proceeded to the place mentioned and found their motor car intact.
With their job effectively completed, Mick Leahy summarises the conclusion of the night's activity before dispersal as follows.
I formed all our lads up in the village street, congratulated them on the success of the job, and when they had sung a verse of the soldier's song, dismissed them. The attack on Carrigtwohill Barracks lasted in all about 2.5 hours from the time we opened fire until the capture was completed. Our men suffered no casualties, neither did the RIC garrison.
Michael Burke's recollection of the conclusion of events is consistent with those of Leahy.
In the village street, Michael Leahy had lined up the volunteers and, having brought them to attention, all sang a verse of the national anthem. I was again sent to the crossroads to ensure that units in the vicinity had received the dismiss order. When I returned to the village, the volunteers had dispersed. I returned to Cove on a bike owned by one of the captured RIC garrison.
Before departing, the leader of the raiding party issued a stern warning to the police, as one of the constables related later to the Skibbereen Eagle.
Meanwhile, said the constable, one of the raiders returned through the breach in the wall and gave us a lecture. He said, "We should have shot ye, and we are considering whether we shall do it. Ye have given us a lot of trouble. If ye look to the right or left, you will be shot at once. I suppose you will be making a blow about this in the morning to the authorities. But I may tell you this, that if you leave your barracks before daylight, you will be shot."
They remained silent for some time, but when they began to talk, they were quickly interrupted by 3 men still on guard and silenced for another period. The Skibbereen Eagle again takes up the story.
They suffered on for another period, until they were perfectly satisfied that all the raiders had gone. They resumed the conversation, and Sergeant Scott, looking around, saw one of the keys to the handcuffs on the floor. He took it up and liberated his comrades. Sometime later, around 4:30 a.m, 2 motor cars conveying police arrived from Cork, but there was no trace of the raiding party to be found.
Joseph Ahern, who drove the cache of arms from the scene, was probably, based on his own testament, one of the last to get home following the abandonment of the car. Within an hour of going to bed, he was also the first to be suddenly reminded that the investigation of the authorities was already in full swing.
It was then about 6 a.m, and getting into bed tired out, I was quickly in a sound sleep, but unfortunately not for long, as the RIC from the local barracks arrived about 7. I did not know anything about their arrival until I was awakened by a shaking, and opening my eyes I saw a face surmounted by a glazed police cap bending over me. After a second or two I was wide awake and found myself answering questions as to my movements on the previous night. The answers weren't to the satisfaction of my questioners, as they went off saying they would see me again.
The narrative to date has of necessity been from the perspective of those who carried out the attack. However, extensive reporting by the press nationwide in the days and weeks that followed provided a window to view events from the perspective of those at the receiving end of the bombardment. The reaction within the local community and the observations of various press reporters who visited the site. The Cork Examiner on Monday morning began in dramatic fashion and provided graphic detail of the condition of the barracks in the aftermath of the battle.
The story of the attack is something like one would expect to find in the picture stories of the Wild West. It was made by men utterly reckless of life, and the barracks was defended by men who were equally fearless. The floors of the room facing the back were strewn with cartridges, while in the barrack yard was found bombs which were thrown by the raiders but which failed to explode. Several times during the night, the raiding party called on the police to surrender, but the police were defiant until their ammunition was exhausted. And then, when the last shot had been fired, they procured their bayonets, but these were unavailing against the revolvers of 50 men who rushed through the breach in the wall. To anyone who visited the barracks yesterday, this was only the barest truth. A large opening had been made in the gable end of the wall, thus making an entrance to the day room. The floor is strewn with bricks and mortar, and the same applies to all but one of the other rooms in the building. Constables Shea and Sullivan were knocked down by the explosion. The furniture in the day room was shattered, and the grate behind which the explosion was placed in the wall was blown to fragments.
The Skibbereen Eagle on the following Saturday was even more vocal in its support of the RIC defenders.
Of the many sensational raids which have taken place in Ireland during the past few years, none have exceeded in daring and recklessness the attack upon the police barracks at Carrigtwohill, County Cork, on Saturday night. After a battle which lasted over 4 hours, the police surrendered to superior numbers. The raiding party made prisoners of the sergeant and 5 constables, who put up one of the most gallant fights that has yet been recorded. And during the time it lasted, they displayed a valour and heroism worthy of the best records of the Royal Irish Constabulary.
The same publication gives an equally graphic account of events immediately before and at the point of explosion. These details give a sense of the immediate effects within the barrack.
Silence reigned for some minutes, and then a terrible explosion was heard. The raiders had entered the stable of Mr. O'Grady, which adjoins the barracks, and is situate on the side next to the day room. 2 horses and a pony were in the building, and these were turned loose. A large breach was made, affording easy access to the attacking party. Constables O'Sullivan and O'Shea were in the day room at the time, and they were both knocked down by the force of the explosion, which practically wrecked the room.
The Skibbereen Eagle also records its version of what transpired in the moments after the raiders entered the barracks.
In a few minutes, and before they had time to recover from the shock, armed men entered through the breach in the gable and with rifles and revolvers shouted to them, "Surrender or we will burn down the barracks." As if to show that the raiders meant to put their threat into execution, one of them rushed towards the staircase and threw paraffin oil on it. He was about to set the place on fire when one of the raiders, apparently the ringleader, entered and said he did not want to burn Mrs. Scott, meaning the wife of Sergeant Scott. She was ordered off to the neighbour's house, where she was kindly treated by the owner, Mr. O'Grady.
The Longford leader carried an extensive report on the raid, which focuses on the reactions of local residents as well as that of the local clergy.
The residents of Carrigtwohill did not sleep many hours on Saturday night, and it is doubtful if anyone there went to bed at all. The attack on the barracks is generally condemned, as the local police, who were subjected to such indignities at the hands of the raiders, are most popular in the village. The raiders seem to have come from outlying districts, and they practically took possession of the village. Numbers of inhabitants of the village looked on with amazement at the whole terrible proceedings. At the Masses on Sunday in Carrigtwohill, Reverend Father Bowler PP referred to the outrage, and he said he did not believe there was one of his parishioners concerned in the attack on the police barracks. Reverend Father Kelleher CC spoke in similar terms.
Monday's Cork Examiner carries interviews with 3 of the besieged occupants of the barrack, which conveys their sense of shock. The first, an unnamed constable, highlights the devastation caused and captures the sense of relief having survived the ordeal.
One of the constables, in an interview with an Examiner reporter, said, "The firing opened at about 10:30. The raiders took up positions behind the barracks and they fired continuously until 3 o'clock in the morning. There must have been 100 men firing, and the reports of their rifles were deafening. It is said that others of them took up positions on the roads leading to the village and held up cars and bicycles, while a third party cut the telegraph and telephone wires. Every window at the back of the barracks is smashed to bits, and the ceilings of the rooms are perforated with bullet holes, and every man in the barracks is telling today of his providential escape."
Mrs. Mary Scott, the sergeant's wife, told of her personal ordeal prior to her release and praised her co-captives for their courage in adversity.
Mrs. Scott told an Examiner reporter of her experiences. "I was in bed," she said, "when the firing opened and several bullets came through my window before we made for the sitting room. My room was, I think, the first through which bullets came. The sitting room adjoins my bedroom, and I was afraid bullets would come through the door. However, they didn't, and my losses through the raid were a gold watch, a gold ring, and about £18. The explosion, which made the opening into the day room, was deafening. We were all stunned by the shock, and the guard and the other men deserve all possible praise for the way in which they faced it all." Those of the men who entered the barracks spoke with an accent.
The second unnamed constable provides details of events subsequent to the raiders entering the barracks until their release.
Some of these men were disguised, others were not, but all had revolvers. When we found that they were in, said one of the constables, we had no alternative but to submit, but we never suspected that they could break through the wall. After surrender, it was, "Hands up, your barracks are taken," said one of the leaders of the party, and then he ordered us to face the wall. We were handcuffed at the time, and there were rifles and revolvers to our heads. 2 men, each take charge of 1 policeman, was another command, while from the same man came the order, "Men, search the house and take everything but money." When we got released from our handcuffs, continued the policeman, it was 4:30 in the morning.
A number of English newspapers covered the events. The Daily Herald carried 2 reports. The first, a brief but dramatic overview with much of the detail inconsistent with that in any of the Irish publications.
Most sensational among the Irish events of the weekend is the blowing up of the police station in Carrigtwohill, County Cork, on Saturday night. Just before 10 o'clock, writes the Cork correspondent of the Central News, 300 armed men attacked the police barracks and fired volleys into it. The sergeant and 5 constables in occupation returned the fire, and a fusillade was kept up for over 3 hours. Finding they were unable to effect an entrance by that means, the attackers threw a bomb and blew away one end of the barracks. Rushing in through the breach so made, they took the police prisoners and handcuffed them. The raiders then searched the entire premises and took away rifles, ammunition and accoutrements, in addition to a sum of £115. They then held a council of war as to whether to shoot the police on the spot or not. Finally, the leader of the band told the police that they had carried out their duties well and had given them a good deal of trouble in the capture of the barracks, finishing with a threat that if it were rebuilt, they would again capture it and blow it up. The party then decamped with their loot, but they took the precaution of cutting the telephone wire connecting Carrigtwohill with Youghal and Middleton.
The other suggests to readers that they should cast a critical eye over everything they read. Under the heading Faked Battle, the correspondent hints that fake news was alive and well long before President Trump invented it.
Dublin, Monday. The story of the Battle of Carrigtwohill is thrilling reading. But in Ireland, one develops a curious scepticism in these matters, and I regret to say there are many scoffers who disbelieve the police story. That discovery that something unusual was happening, their heroic fight with perfect coolness and discipline, of 5 men against 1, 2 or 300, their stern resistance for 5 long hours under deafening rifle fire until the last cartridge, the last grenade were gone. All by a sheer miracle, without a single casualty of any kind. The final surrender and the lucky discovery an hour later of a key that unlocked the handcuffs. All these things Dublin cynics find quite unbelievable. For my own part, it seems clear that some men did fire shots at Carrigtwohill Barracks, did blow in a wall, did compel the police to surrender their rifles. Beyond that, heaven knows. But before you place too much faith in official stories, remember there is such a thing as propaganda.
By the following Saturday's Cork Examiner, we gather that initial expectation was that the barracks would be repaired and reopened in due course. Carrigtwohill RIC Barracks never reopened. The occupants were redeployed to other stations locally, initially on a temporary basis. One of the last press reports relating to this incident, carried in the Dublin establishment publication The Freeman's Journal on the 29th of January, confirmed the closure.
Sinn Féin flag on a barrack. Since the abandonment by the police of the barrack in the village of Carrigtwohill, which was damaged so much in the recent attack, a large Sinn Féin flag has been hoisted on the chimney.
Francis Healy of the Carrigtwohill D Company provides the final postscript to the events of this period in Carrigtwohill by clarifying the source of the flag referred to in the previous article.
By the end of April 1920, the IRA burned down or destroyed 182 unoccupied police barracks all over Ireland, so as to prevent reoccupation by the RIC, who for the time being had been transferred to large towns for their own safety, as a number of the barracks had been attacked and captured by the IRA. I remember climbing to the chimney top of the Carrigtwohill RIC Barracks after it had been destroyed by fire and explosions, and placing a large tricolour flag on top of the gable end chimney.
In conclusion, it is perhaps hardly surprising that the wordsmith who penned the Bobbies of Carrig was less than complimentary to the RIC men.
When the handcuffs were open and the peelers set free, Sergeant Scott he cried out, "Bring my wife into me. She was taken last night by that ignorant set. She got such a fright, she'll never forget." Now Constable Sullivan, Hogan and Shea, next morning to mass they went for to pray, and the people they saw them looking so pale, they said they'd make fine monkeys if they had a tail. Cheer up, jolly fellows, don't die in despair, for the rebels of Carrig your devils may care. So now to conclude and to finish my song, the peelers were quietened and it didn't take long. All honour is given, I'm sure you were told, to the boys who were wearing the green, white and gold. Cheer up, jolly fellows, don't die in despair, for the rebels in Carrig your devils may care. Cheer up, jolly fellows, don't die in despair, for the rebels of Carrig your devils may care.
The result of the 1918 general election, where Sinn Féin candidates won 77 seats out of 105 in all of Ireland, was viewed by the public at large as a plebiscite on Irish independence. This was put into practice when, on the 21st of January 1919, Dáil Éireann met for the first time and approved a provisional constitution and endorsed a declaration of independence. These events gave a significant sense of legitimacy to the volunteer movement, who now, in many instances, assumed the role of agents for the newly formed Dáil Éireann. This point is highlighted by Francis Healy, an officer in Carrigtwohill's D Company of the 4th Battalion.
In addition, we were collectors for the Dáil loan. The levy for the loan was fixed according to valuation of each holding, and in some cases there were point-blank refusals from the ascendancy class to recognise the Dáil or any of its officials, either members of the army, police or district justices.
The political emphasis for most of 1919 was on winning international recognition for the legitimacy of Ireland's independence claims, particularly with Eamon de Valera campaigning across America for both political and financial backing. While raids on RIC stations continued around the country to bolster arms stocks, these were initiated locally and without the approval of GHQ. Indeed, Michael Leahy, Commandant of the Cove Company, highlights the casual relations between the public and most RIC officers as late as October 1919, when he was first viewing the viability of a mass invasion of RIC stations nationwide.
The policemen, especially on Saturday nights, were usually out and about, or maybe engaged playing cards in the barracks with local men. Some of the latter were quite often members of the local volunteer company. Entrance to the barracks would be a simple matter, and the success of the project would, in my opinion, so far as my command in East Cork was concerned, be practically assured.
From the end of October to December 1919, however, there was a growing realisation of the damage being inflicted on the cause by the collection of intelligence at ground level nationwide and passing up the line to Dublin Castle. The emergence of an aggressive guerrilla-style military campaign was commencing, and RIC stations around the country were being heavily fortified in preparation. The definitive analysis of the revolutionary period, the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, acknowledges that the taking of the Carrigtwohill RIC station has a legitimate claim to be regarded as the real commencement of the War of Independence, being the first successful attack on an RIC barracks to have the backing of GHQ.
In early January 1920, the Cork No. 1 Brigade received sanction from IRA General Headquarters, GHQ, to simultaneously attack 3 RIC barracks, which perhaps offers a more logical starting point for the Irish War of Independence than Solo Head Big. From this point until the autumn of 1920, Cork IRA units undertook a series of well-planned sorties that yielded precious arms and cleared strategic locales of their police presence. These early successes generated Republican self-belief, inspired similar attacks in neighbouring areas, and damaged the prestige of the Crown forces.
The success had significance around the country. It provided momentum to the movement nationwide. From now on, attacks on stations were primarily for the destruction of the base. By October 1920, close to 500 had been permanently closed. Had all three sanctioned raids in Cork failed, it could have had serious negative effects nationwide.
The first blow had been struck to eliminate the eyes and ears of the British military. Without the local knowledge, the British forces were practically blind and deaf, and therefore at a great disadvantage in the type of warfare that was now about to be waged against them.
The successful attack on Carrigtwohill RIC Barracks was, according to one of the participants, the first joint venture undertaken by the Cove and Middleton companies, and strong bonds of friendship were formed. When the 4th Battalion Flying Column was formed in September 1920, the predominantly Middleton membership was strongly bolstered by the presence of a number of Cove Company members. There were an estimated 25 plus volunteers at the heart of the battle, with perhaps 10 more manning the checkpoints at the eastern end and western ends of the village. Some of these may have approached to help with the removal of munitions after the battle. It was possible from transcripts to identify 24 of the participants from both the Cove and Middleton companies. Many were later members of the 4th Brigade Flying Column. All participants came through the Carrigtwohill raid unscathed, as did the RIC personnel. However, a number of the volunteers involved in the Carrigtwohill raid were destined to lose their lives during or in the aftermath of the Clonmulk ambush in the spring of 1921. The following list of casualties was collated from Tom O'Neill's excellent new edition of The Battle of Clonmulk. Michael Desmond Middleton, killed the 20th of February 1921. David Desmond Middleton, killed the 20th of February 1921. Michael Hallahan Middleton, killed the 20th of February 1921. Jeremiah Hearn Middleton, killed the 20th of February 1921. James Ahern Cove, killed on the 20th of February 1921. Paddy O'Sullivan Cove, executed on the 28th of April 1921. Morris Moore Cove, executed the 28th of April 1921. Diarmid Hurley Middleton, killed on the 28th of May 1921. Jack Ahern Middleton died in 1923.
Oh, the bobbies in Carrig were shaking in fear when some raiders with arms came flocking in here. They called on surrender, no answer they got. Begarces their leader will fire on the spot. Cheer up, jolly fellows, don't die in despair, for the rebels in Carrig or the devils may care. Now the firing it started at Kate Murphy's shop, where Lizzie and Molly were ready to drop, and Kate in the kitchen didn't know what to do. She ran out in the yard without stocking her shoe. She ran over the field, they'd any heart not to call, for the honour of God take me over the wall. From that to Dick Flynn, and she knocked on the door, and there she remained till 3:45. Cheer up, jolly fellows, don't die in despair, for the rebels in Carrig or devils may care. The first came along that the raiders had seen, Johnny Power from the rock coming from Tullagreen. When asked by the raiders what he was doing there, he was courting the lassie with the dark curly hair. The raider he laughed with a wink in his eye. I pity your case, my poor Irish boy. It's no night for courting nor neither for stroll. So now if you please put your nose to the pole. Cheer up, jolly fellows, don't die in despair, for the rebels in Carrig are the devils make care. Now Johnny at Terry's, he got the great fright. He was woke from his sleep in the middle of the night. He called up to Miss Jo, and it was his delight, for he slept on her sofa for the rest of the night. Now patching the waxer, he went to the bog, and a drain he fell in because of the fog. A raider came on him with rifle in hand, saying, "Waxer, we'll shoot you if you're not going to stand." "Look here, mate," says Paddy, "'tis I'm in a fix. I came down to the bog for a handful of sticks. If you're out for shooting by the light of the moon, the first shot you fire, let it be at Muldoon. Cheer up, jolly fellows, don't die in despair, for the rebels of Carrig are the devils make care." Now the firing had started and lasted 4 hours. Some bullets and bombs were going in great showers. Next came an explosion and gelignite and fuse, and tried to resist, but they found it no use. When the whole it was blown, it made a great space, where the peelers and raiders they stood face to face. The bobbies surrendered, they had to give in. They were tied up and handcuffed by some disguised men. Cheer up, jolly fellows, don't die in despair, for the rebels in Carrig are devils make care. They first took some rifles that amounted to sticks, and also some bikes that amounted to 6. Then off with their booty they quickly did go. Top coats and revolvers were taken also. Now ex-Sergeant Casey to the barracks made way. The first man he met was Constable Shea. To open the handcuffs of him he implored. "I think," says old Shea, "you'll find the keys on the floor." When the handcuffs were open and the peelers set free, Sergeant Scott he cried out, "Bring my wife into me. She was taken last night by that ignorant set. She got such a fright, she'll never forget." Now Constable Sullivan, Hogan and Shea, next morning to Mass they went for to pray. And the people they saw them looking so pale, they said they'd make fine monkeys if they had a tail. Cheer up, jolly fellows, don't die in despair, for the rebels of Carrig are devils make care. So now to conclude and to finish my song, the peelers were quietened and it didn't take long. All honour is given, I'm sure you were told, to the boys who were wearing the green, white and gold. Cheer up, jolly fellows, don't die in despair, for the rebels in Carrig are devils make care. Cheer up, jolly fellows, don't die in despair, for the rebels of Carrig are devils make care.
The success had significance around the country. It provided momentum to the movement nationwide. From now on, attacks on stations were primarily for the destruction of the base. By October 1920, close to 500 had been permanently closed. Had all 3 sanctioned raids in Cork failed, it could have had serious negative effects nationwide. The success had significance around the country. It provided momentum to the movement nationwide. From now on, attacks on stations were primarily for the destruction of the base. By October 1920, close to 500 had been permanently closed. Had all 3 sanctioned raids in Cork failed, it could have had serious negative effects nationwide. Joseph Ahern concurs with the significance